Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. First of all, let me apologize for the slight delay in starting today's session. Unfortunately, we faced few technical issues and now we are back live. So before we begin today's the Hindu analysis, we have an important announcement. In a short while, Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman is all set to present the Union Budget. I hope all of you know how important the Union Budget document is for UPSC Civil Services Examination. So to help you simplify your preparation for the Union Budget, today we are going to host a special live session at 8 p.m. and Sham sir is going to break down the Union Budget, explain the key highlights and provide the important analysis that is required for the exams. So do watch the session without fail. And if you're liking our initiatives, do support us by pressing the like button, share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also don't forget, as soon as the Hindu's analysis ends, immediately head to our Telegram channel. The link for the Telegram channel has been given in the description box below, because as soon as the CNA ends, we have a quiz on these topics that goes live on the Telegram channel. Take these questions, it helps you practice these topics, revise them for the upcoming prelims. So let's get started with the analysis of today's the Hindu newspaper by looking at the articles we are going to cover in today's discussion. From the Delhi edition, I have chosen 6 important articles. We have an article related to Pakistan and the way in which Pakistan has sponsored terrorism, which is consuming Pakistan itself today. There is an important editorial related to this. We'll examine this topic in complete detail. Then we shall talk about an article examining the solar energy option for India, whether solar energy is a viable renewable energy option for India. It's an important article for both economy and environment and ecology, and hence we shall understand this topic in detail as well. Then we have another topic from international relations from page number 7 of the Delhi edition, which examines the current situation in Myanmar and how it impacts the region and India. Then we shall talk about the theory of alienation that was brought out by Karl Marx, and the Hindu carries a detailed analysis of this important political theory on page number 9. Then we shall look at a development with regard to India-US relations. A top meeting has taken place between senior officials of the Indian and US governments. We shall talk about this. There's an article from page number 12. And from the front page, we have an article related to Andhra Pradesh, where the Chief Minister has announced that Vizag or Visakhapatnam would become the new capital for Andhra Pradesh. This happens to be a big development as well. So all these key topics will be covered in detail. So please stay with me for the next 50 to 55 minutes. Let's start with the first article, the editorial on page number 6. As I mentioned, this editorial examines the role of Pakistan in sponsoring terrorism in the region. It examines how Pakistan itself has today become a victim of terrorism and the extremism it has bred as a part of its geopolitics. This analysis becomes all the more important because recently, just a couple of days back, Pakistan was hit by a devastating terror attack. Many of you would have read about this in newspapers. In the city of Peshawar, which is located in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, there was a deadly terror attack against a mosque in which more than 100 people have been killed. This devastating terror attack was carried out by a group called TTP or Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. This group is also referred to as the Pakistan Taliban. It is seen as the Pakistani branch of the Taliban. So the TTP or the Pakistan Taliban has repeatedly attacked the Pakistani state itself, and today it is posing a very serious internal security threat for Pakistan. In this context, we need to understand the role of Pakistan in breeding terrorism in the region. We should understand in detail what exactly has Pakistan done along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to create a terror factory which has destabilized the entire region. We should examine Pakistan's connections with various terrorist organizations and why TTP in particular is targeting the Pakistani state itself. So these are some important points to discuss, and let's begin from 1980s. See, by 1971, Pakistan had lost 3 wars against India. especially the liberation of Bangladesh, was a humiliating moment for Pakistan as India had broken the country into two parts. So by mid-1970s, Pakistan realized that India was a conventionally superior power, that India couldn't be defeated in a conventional war. So somewhere around mid-1970s, Pakistan adopted a strategy of bleeding India through 1,000 cuts. This was a reference to Pakistan's covert proxy war against India, which was all set to begin, where Pakistani state agencies such as the ISI, its intelligence agency, and the Pakistani army would directly enable terrorist outfits against India in order to destabilize India. So thus began Pakistan's campaign of sponsoring a secret proxy war against India. This covert war of Pakistan against India, which has gone on for the last 40-50 years, is directly linked with the developments in neighboring Afghanistan. Around the same period, in 1979, the then Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and occupied the country. This was the heights of Cold War, where US and Soviet Union were fighting for influence and competing against each other in almost every country. As American influence was on the rise in the Afghanistan region, the Soviet Union, which felt threatened as it shared borders with Afghanistan, invaded the country and captured the country for a short while. The Americans saw this as an opportunity to hit back at the Soviet forces, and the US aligned with Pakistan, and together they began a covert war against the Soviet Union. Starting from 1980s, with the direct financial support and the intelligence support of US, Pakistan would create a terror ecosystem all along the Durand Line, which marks the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Durand Line marks the boundary here between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So along this border, Pakistan would create a terror factory, a terror ecosystem, stretching from Balochistan to the tribal areas in Waziristan, going all the way up till the Wakhan corridor over here. So all across the Afghan-Pakistan border, that is along the Durand Line, Pakistan would create terror sanctuaries. It would play a direct role in the creation of the Afghan Mujahideen, which was set up as a resistance against the occupying Soviet forces. The Americans had a direct role to play in this. They would fund this war, provide the weapons, the support needed for Pakistan to train and create the Afghan Mujahideen. So very quickly, Pakistan promoted extremism, radicalism, and across this region, it ended up creating a terror factory of sorts. It used the same infrastructure to promote anti-India terror outfits, including the Khalistan terror groups, the Kashmir-centric terror outfits. So by 1980s, Pakistan had launched a full-scale covert war against India by using the same facilities which it had established to create the Afghan Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So as the Afghan Mujahideen were fighting the Soviet forces, parallelly Pakistan was diverting the same infrastructure, the same funds and weapons to fund and enable anti-India terror groups, including both the Khalistan outfits and the Kashmir-centric outfits. So many outfits like Babar Khalsa International, Khalistan Zindabad Force, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Hizbul Mujahideen, all these terror outfits would be nurtured by the Pakistani state, and especially the Afghanistan-Pakistan border would become a breeding ground of terrorism. This became Pakistan's policy against India. And in this region, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa region that you see here, this is the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, also called KP, right? Here you see the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is an integral part of the Indian territory. Today, it's a union territory, but large parts of J&K are illegally occupied by Pakistan over here, the Gilgit-Baltistan region, right? So the region sandwiched between Jammu and Kashmir, Sindh, Balochistan and Punjab province of Pakistan and Afghanistan. This region is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which is a tribal dominated area. So in this region, Pakistan has created a terror sanctuary for various terror outfits, and Afghan Taliban, which today has captured power in the country, rose to power, rose to influence in the same region. The Afghan Mujahideen, which was brought up in the 1980s, would eventually defeat the Soviet forces and the Soviet Union retreated. By 1990s, the Soviet forces had retreated. The Mujahideen, which won the war, was now fighting for power, fighting to capture the government in Afghanistan. So the 1990s witnessed a brutal civil war in Afghanistan between various warlords, and eventually one of the radical factions of the Mujahideen, called the Taliban, rose up to power with the direct support of Pakistan's ISI and its army. The Taliban, or the Afghan Taliban, was seen as a puppet of Pakistan. To ensure Pakistan retains its leverage in Afghanistan, to ensure that Pakistan could use Afghanistan for its strategic depth against India, it would prop this radical outfit called the Taliban, which was a byproduct of the Afghan Mujahideen. So the Taliban, which rose to prominence in 1990s, would quickly capture power in the country by 1996 and form the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So now Afghanistan came under the rule of an extremist radical outfit. The Taliban would shelter various terror groups including the Al-Qaeda and many other branches of the Taliban like Haqqani network. They would flourish along this region. As Al-Qaeda started targeting Western countries and as it carried out the 9/11 attacks, finally Western countries brought their focus towards Afghanistan and the Taliban's regime. The US, along with a coalition force, invaded Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks in 2001 to topple the Taliban government, to hunt down Al-Qaeda and to remove Taliban from power. So as Taliban was thrown out of power, led by the American invasion, the Taliban sought shelter in neighboring Pakistan. Pakistan would willingly support and shelter the Taliban militants all across Balochistan and as well as the tribal areas, particularly in the Swat Valley, in the Swat Valley region of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and in the tribal areas of Waziristan. So here, various jihadist militant organizations would back the Taliban against the foreign forces. Pakistan was directly enabling them, working with them, sheltering these outfits, as these groups were vital for Pakistan's covert war against India. For Pakistan, the Taliban was always a puppet, which gave Pakistan leverage along these border areas and in Afghanistan, where anti-India terror groups could be bred. So this strategy led Pakistan to promote these terror outfits as it treated them as good terrorist outfits. In the eyes of Pakistan, in the perspective of Pakistan, these were good terror organizations. This was good terrorism as it was serving Pakistan's interests. Pakistan's interest was to target India, to destabilize India and promote anti-India terror outfits. So as the Taliban and other various radical outfits were enabling this, Pakistan would nurture them, allow them to operate freely all across the border region, particularly in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa region. So in the middle of this conflict, where the Taliban, that is the Afghan Taliban, was locked in a conflict with the US and the foreign forces, another faction of the Taliban came up called the Pakistan Taliban, or TTP. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has its roots in 2002, following the invasion of the US into Afghanistan. It was formally established in 2007 as the Pakistani branch of Taliban, which would back the Afghan Taliban. It has always pledged allegiance or loyalty to the Afghan Taliban, and they both share a common ideology. They are ideological brothers. Their ideology is to topple the governments here, capture political power, and form Islamic Emirates. Just like the Afghan Taliban, Pakistan Taliban, or TTP, is an equally radical extremist terrorist organization. So now recently, when Afghan Taliban captured power again in Afghanistan in 2021, the Pakistan branch of Taliban, the TTP, has accepted the Afghan Taliban government and pledged loyalty to the Afghan Taliban. These two branches of Taliban, they might be structurally different. Organizationally, they might be different. They might have different targets. But ideologically, they come from the same source. They are ideological brothers. So what Pakistan has done, the Pakistani state, it has nurtured and tolerated Afghan Taliban as it fulfilled its geopolitical interests. While the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, has been seen as a bad terrorist organization with the Pakistani state, as TTP aims to overthrow the Pakistani state itself. The TTP, like I said, is seen as the Pakistani branch of Taliban. It wants to replicate what Afghan Taliban has done. The Afghan Taliban has thrown out the Afghan government, thrown out the foreign invaders and captured political power. So the TTP over the last 15 odd years has been trying to topple the Pakistani state. It's been waging an insurgent war against Pakistan itself. Its objective is to throw Pakistani state out and capture power in Pakistan, just like the Afghan Taliban has done in Afghanistan. So here Pakistan makes a distinction between forms of terrorism. It sees Afghan Taliban and other terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Lashkar, Jaish-e-Mohammed as good terrorists, as they are enabling Pakistan's covert war against India. But it only acts against groups like Pakistan Taliban or the TTP, which are targeting the Pakistani state itself. So this distinction that Pakistan creates is at the very root of Pakistan's problems. And this is what the editorial is pointing out. Today, Pakistan doesn't realize that it is facing its biggest internal security threat. In the business of breeding terrorism as a geopolitical weapon against India, it has nurtured so many radical outfits that today terrorism is consuming the Pakistani state itself. Recently, when Afghan Taliban came to power in Afghanistan, when it captured power in 2021, after toppling the Afghan government, it brokered a deal between TTP and the Pakistani government. Since Afghan Taliban is close to TTP, and since it is close to Pakistani state, it mediated a ceasefire through which TTP had reduced its attacks against Pakistan. But this ceasefire has ended since November 2022, because now the TTP has emerged stronger. It used the ceasefire to regroup and rearm itself, and today the TTP has stepped up its attacks against Pakistan. In the last 8 to 10 years, the TTP has pulled off many big terror attacks. You might have heard about the terror attack in Peshawar, where a school was targeted in 2014 and more than 150 school children were killed. This was one of the most brutal terror attacks the world had seen, where innocent school-going children were targeted. This attack was also carried out by the TTP. Just 2 days ago, another major attack has been pulled off by this group where more than 100 people have been killed. And this is not just one incident. Multiple such incidents have happened in the last 3-4 months, which has increased volatility in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan. It clearly shows that Pakistan is losing control here, because even earlier, factions of TTP and other terror groups, they had captured control in the Swat Valley, in the tribal areas, federally administered tribal areas that existed back then. These terror groups had captured territory, removed Pakistan from its control. But Pakistani army had fought back to regain control of these areas. So Pakistan's state control in this sensitive region is under threat, and it is possible for these terror outfits to run over the Pakistani state, at least in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And this poses a very, very serious challenge, not just for Pakistan, but for India and for the entire South Asia region. So this is the concern that the editorial is bringing up. Now don't forget, Pakistan is facing a dual challenge here. On one hand, it is facing a very serious economic crisis. Its currency has crashed. Inflation is at an all-time high. There is power crisis in Pakistan. Its forex reserves have plummeted, and it is unable to repay the loans it has borrowed. It has approached the IMF for a bailout package, and its economy is on the brink of collapse. Parallelly, it is dealing with a very serious internal security threat posed by the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, which has increased its presence and influence in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It has increased the number of attacks it has carried out and poses a very serious challenge to the very existence and survival of the Pakistani state. This is a very, very serious concern for the entire world, because Pakistan is a nuclear armed state. Any failure of the Pakistani state could lead the nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands, which would be an absolute nightmare scenario for India, US and any other power which is involved in the region. That is why the editorial is suggesting to Pakistan that it should stop distinguishing between good terrorism and bad terrorism. It criticizes Pakistan's selective approach in harboring few terror outfits while targeting only few terror outfits. it has targeted only those groups which it sees as bad terror outfits like the TTP. Whereas it has nurtured the other groups like the Taliban, Afghan Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Toiba and the others. Pakistan fails to realize that these terror groups, they share ideological connections. If it is breeding one form of terrorism, eventually it will enable the other form of terrorism as well. So editorial is calling upon Pakistan to carry out a paradigm shift in its approach, to make a radical change in its approach and to target all forms of terrorism if the Pakistani state has to survive. So that is the important point the editorial is driving across, and I think it's a very, very important analysis for our mains examination. There could be a question on this in international relations or in internal security. There could be an entire essay topic on the security and economic situation of Pakistan and how it could affect India and the South Asia region. So that is why the topic is very important. Now let's move on to the second article. I would like to take up this column from page number 6 that evaluates the option of solar energy as a viable or alternative for renewable forms of energy. It examines whether solar energy is the best option for India. And the writer, who is an expert in the field of energy, he's an energy economist, he argues that solar energy is not necessarily the best alternative. He argues that it is not viable to place all our hopes on solar energy to help India transition towards renewable forms of energy. See, India has made a pledge. We have committed to the Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement. We have taken up our voluntary contributions, also called intended nationally determined contributions. And under the Paris Agreement, we have committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. We plan to get to net zero emissions by increasing our renewable energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by the end of this decade. We have promised to the Paris Agreement and the Climate Change Convention that by the end of this decade, 50% of our energy will come from non-fossil sources, that is from renewable sources. And within renewables, the highest priority has been given for solar energy. The Modi government especially has given top priority for expanding India's solar energy projects. You can see in this graph how exponential growth has been registered in renewable sources of energy in India, and particularly solar energy constitutes a majority part of it. In the last few years, there has been an exponential adoption of renewable forms of energy, particularly solar energy. The government has projected that solar energy is something that is free, something which is emission free as well, cost effective, and with better technology available, with better photovoltaic cells available today, better raw materials available today, the government has said that solar energy is very, very feasible. At one point, solar energy was expensive. The per unit cost was expensive compared to other traditional forms of energy. But due to wider adoption and due to the push given by the government and its policies, various subsidies, the cost of solar energy has definitely gone down. The per unit cost has gone down. So this has been pitched as the right alternative for India, as a viable option for India to switch to renewables, and solar energy occupies the biggest basket in the coming decades. So here the writer evaluates whether this is the right option for us. This is just a counter argument. Yes, solar energy has a number of advantages, no doubt about it. That is why India is pushing this initiative called the International Solar Alliance. India has formed an international organization to promote the acceptance and usage of solar energy. And we are also championing an initiative called One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative to create a regional and a global grid based on renewable energy, primarily driven by solar energy. While India is right in prioritizing solar energy, it does have its drawbacks. That is what the writer is talking about. He points to a finding of the Central Electricity Authority, according to which India will have to spend around 2.44 lakh crore rupees over the next 7 to 8 years in order to install 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity. If majority of it is coming from solar, then the investments would be way beyond India's capacity. The writer is pointing out the investments required to make this transition is very, very high, something which would drain the Indian economy, and it may not be entirely cost effective as it has been projected. Now, if you look at India's energy basket, as of 2022, majority of our energy comes from fossil sources, especially coal from thermal power plants. Within the renewable sector, solar occupies the top share, followed by wind, biomass, nuclear, small hydro projects and other sources. So clearly there is a bias in government policy towards solar energy. Yes, solar energy, like I said, has many benefits. It's emission free, it is freely available, it helps in cutting down greenhouse gas emissions, reducing air pollution, which is a concern with regard to fossil fuels like coal. But apart from that, solar energy does have its drawbacks. It may not be entirely as cost effective as it is being projected. There are many misconceptions according to the writer. He says that solar pricing and coal power pricing has been compared and equated. He says this is a wrong comparison. See, today statistics show that per unit cost of solar power has come down and it is almost comparable to the per unit cost of electricity generated through coal-based power plants. The writer dismisses this theory. He says this is a misconception because there is a difference in the way in which solar power and coal power is being calculated. When energy from coal power is being calculated, the logistics cost of moving coal is also included. In calculating the electricity cost per unit, the logistic cost involved in moving the coal from the mine to the power plant is also included, which accounts for nearly half of the total price of this electricity. Is that clear? So it is not just the coal resource which is being accounted for and the electricity generation process which is being accounted for, even the logistics cost has been included here. If you look at solar power and its price calculation, the need for storing solar energy by batteries has been excluded from the price computation. This is a critical flaw according to the writer, because you're not comparing two like forms of energy. Solar and coal are two different forms of energy because coal provides for continuous electricity. If the coal supplies are ensured, it gives you constant electricity. You don't have to store electricity generated by thermal power plants. You can just transmit them, dispatch them. This will not happen in the case of solar electricity because solar electricity is not continuous, it is intermittent. You can't generate solar electricity during the night time, during cloudy conditions, during winter season. Depends on weather conditions, right? So solar power has to be stored and it requires large investments in battery technology, and these investments are not accounted for in computing the price of solar power. This is a very valid point that the writer is bringing up because you're not accounting for the battery cost, the storage cost involved in solar power. Whereas in case of coal, the logistic cost has been computed. So this leads to an artificial increase of the per unit cost of coal-based power and artificially brings down the per unit cost of solar power, thereby creating a misconception that solar power is becoming cheaper than coal. The writer dismisses this by pointing out this flaw in the way in which the prices are calculated. Then upon this, solar energy is being made financially viable because the government, the industry is excluding the battery cost, the storage cost is getting excluded. They're not computing for this. And the government policy is being aggressively promoted through subsidies, concessions, etc. To promote green forms of energy, cleaner, renewable forms of energy, the government is giving a lot of subsidies, concessions to the solar industry, which is also artificially reducing the cost. And the policy is being pushed on the industry and the distribution companies, which are not finding it viable to distribute solar power as of now. So the writer's argument here is that solar power may not be as viable as it is being projected. Right now it looks viable because the most important cost, which is the battery storage cost, has been excluded. And the government is cushioning the additional cost by giving subsidies, by making concessions, and by forcing the policy on the industry and the distribution companies. If these policy support, if they are taken out, then the writer's argument is solar power costs will shoot up. And also there are associated emissions from the battery industry, which is not being accounted for. So solar energy may not be as clean as you might think, because the storage involved, the battery technology that is needed on the back end, will also lead to a lot of emissions. The production of batteries will go up, contributing to more emissions and pollution. So these costs have not been computed according to the writer, and hence the writer argues that solar may not be the right alternative. It need not be the only alternative as it is being projected. He says, along with solar, along with other forms of energy, we have to prioritize large hydropower projects. This is something that India has largely neglected, because hydropower has proven low carbon potential. It is seen as a low cost option as well. And this is something many developed economies have already exploited. If you look at US and Europe, they have harnessed 90 to 98% of their hydropower potential, whereas India has harnessed hardly around 15% of its hydropower potential. And I hope you know that India has tremendous hydropower potential because of the Himalayan mountains, the perennial rivers, and the other mighty peninsular rivers as well. India has tremendous hydropower potential, and we have hardly touched 15% of it. Look at China, for example. Even China is making a big switch towards renewables. Even though China is dependent on coal heavily, it is also making a switch towards coal, nuclear, and hydropower and wind power as well. So China is one country which has really prioritized large hydro projects. The best example is the Three Gorges project of China on the Yangtze River, which today is the world's biggest hydroelectric project. While China is diversifying its energy sources to bring down emissions while sustaining the economy, India is seen to be driven by misconceptions related to solar energy, and we are neglecting other forms of energy such as large hydro projects. This is the writer's argument. The writer is not saying we should continue relying on coal forever. The writer agrees that coal is a dirty fuel. It leads to pollution, leads to emissions, global warming. Yes, we have a commitment to reduce our emissions. We have a commitment to switch to cleaner, renewable forms of energy. But solar energy need not be the only alternative. Solar energy has a lot of additional costs which is not being shown, which is not being projected as of now. This is the point the writer is trying to make, and he is suggesting that India should diversify its energy basket. We should give equal priority to not just solar energy but also to other renewable forms such as large hydro projects, which often faces opposition in India on environmental grounds, along with prioritizing wind, nuclear energy and others. So this is the crux of the article. The writer is dismissing some of the misconceptions regarding solar energy, and he is arguing why this is not the only alternative. If India is blinded by this approach, we may pay a heavy price in the future because of the higher cost associated with solar energy. So that is the important analysis that the writer is bringing out through this column. Now let's move to the next article. From page number 7, we have this column related to Myanmar. The article is written by former Indian ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, who has served as the Indian ambassador to Myanmar, and he examines the current political situation in the country. So before I talk about the article, let me just give you a brief history of Myanmar. Let's take a brief look at the political history of Myanmar. See, Myanmar has gone through long periods of turbulence. It gained independence in 1948 from Britain. Back then it was known as Burma. Very quickly it renamed itself as Myanmar. After a short period of democracy, Myanmar immediately came under military rule in early 1960s. Myanmar's military was always meddling in the internal politics of Myanmar. It dismissed the government. It blamed the government for not tackling ethnic insurgencies, armed insurgencies, and blamed that the government was corrupt and it was ineffective. And the military toppled the government in 1961-62 and captured power through a military coup. Since then, the military junta has ruled the country. It has exercised its iron grip on Myanmar's administration, and for decades, Myanmar's military has remained powerful and influential. In 1980s, there was a pro-democracy movement led by NLD, the National League for Democracy, which is headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Peace Laureate. So in 1986-88, during that period, Myanmar did witness pro-democracy protests led by Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy. These protests were crushed by Myanmar's military junta, and even the elections which were allowed to take place in 1980s, they were nullified as the military junta didn't want to give up its power to an elected government. It nullified the election results, it abandoned the democratic path again, and placed Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest for several decades. So from 1960s till almost 2010, Myanmar firmly remained under the grip of its military. There was no scope for democracy apart from this minor incident in 1988, where there was a pro-democracy movement and limited elections were held, right? And even this movement was crushed. So throughout this period, throughout this 50-year period, Myanmar has been ruled by military dictatorship. It has been ruled by the military junta. Throughout this period, it has committed a lot of atrocities against ethnic minorities, religious minorities. It has targeted minority groups like Rohingyas. It has targeted various ethnic tribes like the Chins, the Kachins, and the others. So they've all led their own insurgencies and radical extremist groups against the state of Myanmar. So Myanmar has been used to frequent phases of chaos, volatility, and turbulence. Is that clear? So now, throughout this period when Myanmar was crushing democratic rights and human rights, it was targeted by the Western countries and it was placed under economic sanctions. In order to isolate the country and to punish the military leaders for violating human rights and democratic rights, Myanmar was brought under economic sanctions by the Western countries. Under the pressure of these sanctions, finally Myanmar started transitioning towards a democracy, and in 2010, partial democracy was brought in. Elections were held in 2010. Parties like NLD were allowed to contest. However, majority of the seats in the parliament were reserved for Myanmar's military itself. Only few of the seats were thrown open for elections. So it was a partial transition to a democracy. So this change was not recognized by Western countries and the sanctions remained. So in 2015, finally, Myanmar made a full transition to a democracy. The military junta, the army, stepped aside and allowed elections to take place, and a democratic government led by NLD was formed in 2015. So for 5 years, this democratically elected government functioned in Myanmar, and fresh elections took place recently in 2020, during which NLD again won the mandate. NLD was all set to form the government again. This was a clear signal that people of Myanmar preferred democracy. They preferred parties like NLD and leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi. But now with the growing popularity of NLD and democracy, the military leaders felt threatened. So what they did was in 2021, almost exactly 2 years back, they nullified these election results. They said electoral fraud had been committed without any evidence. They alleged electoral malpractices. They nullified the election results and declared emergency again in the country. They removed the elected government from power and captured political power again, thereby staging yet another military coup in Myanmar. This has been the state since the last 2 years. So Myanmar had partially transitioned to a democracy from 2010 to 2015, and finally it had made a fuller transition to democracy from 2015 to 2020. After this short transition, Myanmar is back under military rule because the military leaders have captured power again, and since then a standoff has emerged between 3 factions in Myanmar. This has pushed the country into a deep crisis. On one hand, you have the military junta led by the Myanmar army, which controls all the key powers in Myanmar. There is an opposition, a united opposition led by pro-democracy parties. The various pro-democracy parties which have opposed military rule, they have come together under a parallel government called the National Unity Government, or NUG. They have opposed the military rule and they have taken up protests, including violent protests, to push back the military and reinstall democracy in their country. Then you also have armed ethnic groups, various ethnic groups like the Chins and the others. They have led their own insurgency to protect their rights and to fight back against Myanmar's army. So essentially, Myanmar has been pushed into complete chaos because of the conflict and the violence which has broken out between these three entities. On one hand, there is Myanmar's military, the government today, the military junta, which is crushing the pro-democracy protests, crushing the armed rebellions, and using massive force to kill civilians. On the other hand, you have opposition groups led by NUG fighting for democracy. And you also have armed ethnic insurgent groups fighting for their own causes. So this has led to large-scale violence in the country, and Myanmar's armed forces have not hesitated to use heavy weaponry against their own citizens. In the last few months, Myanmar has used battle tanks, artillery guns. It has even conducted airstrikes against its own people. So there is no scope for reconciliation today, as no side is agreeing for talks. Myanmar's military junta has made it clear that it will not negotiate with the protesters. The opposition NUG has said there is no scope for any surrender, no scope for ending the protests unless and until democracy is restored. The armed ethnic groups are not going to give up insurgency as their option, because that is their only defense against the brutalities of Myanmar's army and its armed forces. So with no scope for reconciliation, violence has only increased, and the Western countries have again hit back with their economic sanctions, and they have tried to isolate the country. But this approach alone will not work, because no matter what the Western countries do, economic sanctions have a limited impact on Myanmar's military junta. Historically, the military junta has shown itself to be resilient. It has been very inflexible, and it has never cooperated with Western countries or also with institutions like the United Nations. No matter what pressure comes from the West and the UN, Myanmar's army will not bend. It has constant support of China, Russia, and to some extent, even India. There are other complex geopolitics that are involved, that are at play, which allows Myanmar's military to withstand the pressure being brought in by the Western countries. So Western countries have tried isolating the military again. They have brought back sanctions against Myanmar's military leaders, but the sanctions have not had the desired impact. The UNSC recently brought up Resolution 2669 in December 2022, condemning the violence in Myanmar and called upon the military to release the political prisoners. This resolution was backed by almost all the permanent members of the UNSC and also by most of the non-permanent members. Nobody vetoed this resolution. India, China, and Russia, they abstained from voting on it, whereas the other members of UNSC, they all backed this resolution. But this resolution also had no impact because UN has very little leverage against Myanmar's military. The reason is, to resolve the situation, regional players like ASEAN have to play a bigger role. ASEAN is a regional grouping of Southeast Asian countries, and Myanmar is an important member. The UN also has encouraged the ASEAN group to play a bigger role. In fact, 1 year before this, in 2021, ASEAN had proposed a 5-point consensus to establish peace in the country and to promote talks between the army and the pro-democracy protesters. But this 5-point consensus was later rejected by the military. Myanmar's military had initially accepted ASEAN's proposal to call for a ceasefire and to talk and negotiate. But this proposal of ASEAN was rejected by the military, and Myanmar's government has refused to cooperate with ASEAN as well. The reason here is, even within the ASEAN group, there is a divide. There are few ASEAN members which are against Myanmar's military at any cost, especially countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Brunei, which are often aligned with Western countries, aligned with US. They are against Myanmar's military. Whereas there is a pro-military faction within ASEAN. Members like Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, they have very close relations with Myanmar's army. And this internal divide of ASEAN also has led to the failure of the group to mediate in this conflict. So ASEAN also has had very limited success in resolving this situation. The other big powers like China and Russia, they have their own geopolitics to play over here. China has very big interests in Myanmar, very big strategic and economic interests. It has invested in the strategic Kyoukphu port. It has developed the strategic Kyoukphu port, which faces the Bay of Bengal. It has invested in the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor as a part of its Belt and Road Initiative. It has built special economic zones, power plants, oil and gas pipelines. It has made very big investments in Myanmar, and China has to protect these interests. It has used Myanmar as a base to sponsor Northeast insurgents against India. It has constantly supported various Northeast insurgents such as NSCN, ULFA and other insurgent groups by using Myanmar as a base. This has been China's covert war against India. So for China, Myanmar is strategically and economically vital, and it has always maintained close relations with Myanmar's army. It reportedly backs few ethnic insurgencies in Myanmar. So irrespective of the situation in Myanmar, China remains a dominant power. It already has close ties with the military. It has other leverages as well because of its widespread investments in the country. So as a result, China remains an influential power, and it is not interested or not too bothered about resolving the current situation. Because the current crisis plays into the hands of China. It enables Chinese interests. Russia also has become another key power, especially Myanmar's generals. The Myanmar army has relied heavily on Russian weaponry, Russian arms, battle tanks, fighter jets, right? They're all sourced from Russia. Myanmar is heavily dependent on defense cooperation with Russia. So as Russia has been isolated by the Western countries following the Ukraine war, Russia and Myanmar have become even closer. So China and Russia have cemented their position in Myanmar, whereas Western countries and ASEAN group and even the UN have been ineffective in resolving the crisis. Now this places India in a dilemma situation. India has two interests to balance. On one hand, we have always maintained good ties with Myanmar's military junta. This has been a realist policy that we have followed. We have ignored idealism in Myanmar. We have ignored the human rights violations Myanmar has committed because there's nothing much India could have done directly to interfere. And we have sought to protect our core national interests because we have very, very important stakes in Myanmar. We have a very big security interest. We need the help of Myanmar to tackle Northeast insurgency. Myanmar has become a safe haven for many insurgent outfits like NSCN and ULFA. China has actively used Myanmar to back these insurgencies against India. So India has relied on Myanmar's help for many decades to tackle Northeast insurgency. We have made big investments in big projects such as the Kaladan multimodal project. We also have the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway project. So these are some big infrastructure connectivity projects which links India with Myanmar and Southeast Asia. It gives us alternate access to Northeast India as well. Plus we are competing with Chinese influence through our big investments. We have very close defense relations with Myanmar's military. We have supplied weapons, provided training to Myanmar's armed forces. Recently, we have even leased a submarine to Myanmar's navy. We have even conducted joint counter-insurgency operations in the region to tackle insurgency. So since we have very important security and economic interests to protect, it is vital for India to retain its close ties with Myanmar's army, irrespective of what violations it is carrying out. On the other hand, this realistic position of India is becoming unsustainable because of the large-scale human rights violations that the military is carrying out. Myanmar's junta has committed large-scale democratic and human rights violations. India, being a democratic state, can't simply ignore this. We can't simply turn a blind eye. So within the Indian government, a divide has come up. Within the foreign ministry, there are two opinions. One side is arguing that India should continue the realistic policy. We should ignore what is happening inside Myanmar. We have no role to play there. We should maintain our close relations with whoever is in power so we can protect our security and economic interests. The other faction within the foreign ministry is arguing that India can't remain silent. We need to take a stand and help build democracy in Myanmar. but this could risk our ties with Myanmar's military. So as of now, India is caught in this dilemma position, but until now, India has not done anything to aggravate the situation in Myanmar. We haven't interfered directly, we haven't criticized Myanmar's military ever. Even at the UN, whenever voting comes up against Myanmar, we abstain from the vote, thereby signaling our indirect support to Myanmar. Right? So this is a very delicate foreign policy balance for India, considering our national interests. So this is what the article is talking about. The writer says there is no hope for Myanmar as of now. Even if fresh elections are held, there is no guarantee that it will be free and fair elections. So India is balancing out its options right now. We are continuing our realistic policy of maintaining good ties with the military while trying to put some pressure, at least as much as possible, to deal with the human rights situation. So this is what you should know about this article. Next, we have an important article on the theory of alienation that was popularized by Karl Marx. This column on page number 9 provides an in-depth analysis and an in-depth explanation of this important political theory. See, Karl Marx, as you know, has been a noted thinker, philosopher. His theories have led to social, political, economic reforms in many parts of the world. It has inspired communism, socialism, right, in the whole strand of left-wing political ideology. So Karl Marx talks about the theory of alienation, which is seen as the bedrock of labor market ideology and its interpretation. He has brought out these studies, he has documented his findings or his theories in economic and philosophical manuscripts, and he has further elaborated on this theory of alienation in his landmark work, which is Das Kapital. He has repeatedly observed how the labor class is made to suffer in a capitalist economy. He has observed how the labor, that is the worker class, the working class, have been segregated, they have been ignored, isolated, and how they have been exploited as well in a capitalist setup where private enterprise is controlling the business, controlling the production. So Karl Marx developed this theory of alienation by studying the theories of Friedrich Hegel, another leading thinker, and he has laid out this concept which highlights the suffering of the workers in the labor class, especially in industries. Now let me tell you more about the theory of alienation. This basic understanding can be very helpful in social issues, also in your optionals, in political science, in public administration, sociology, and in other papers, even in ethics paper as well. According to Karl Marx, in a capitalist setup, right, where the industry is controlled by the private enterprise, by private businesses, workers or laborers are subjected to 4 types of alienation. They are isolated in 4 different ways, according to Karl Marx. First, they are isolated from the product that they are producing. Now imagine a factory, a large factory which is producing mobile phones or cars, for example. Thousands of workers will be working in the plant. These workers are isolated, they are alienated, cut off from the product that they themselves are producing. It basically means these workers can never aspire to procure that product. They produce such expensive products in a capitalist setup that workers can never aspire to procure that phone or the car which they themselves are producing. So they are getting alienated, cut off from the product that they are building, that they are assembling. They have no connection with it. They have no connect with the product, and this is what a capitalist setup ensures. The labor class can never aspire to procure that product. They will never have the means necessary to procure the product they are producing. So there is a complete alienation of the worker from the product. Similarly, the second alienation is alienation of the worker from the process, from the manner of production. The manner of production is mechanized. It becomes routine. It becomes so mechanical at one point that the worker is no longer attached or associated with the process. It's as if the worker is just a machine carrying out a routine task given by the bosses, given by the owners of the industry and the factory, and they are blindly following the process without any sense of attachment. Basically, they are disconnected, alienated from the process, from the manner of production. And the third alienation is from humanity itself. Workers are alienated from their own sense of self-worth. They are treated as machines, as commodity in a capitalist setup. Just like raw materials are commodities to produce a product, similarly the labor, the workers are simply a commodity, a cheap commodity who simply produce like machines with no sense of humanity attached to them. So workers are alienated from their own sense of self-worth, their own sense of humanity, and they are not treated as human beings anymore. They are treated as just machines producing a product. And finally, the fourth alienation is from the worker and his social setting. A worker is alienated from the other workers. They have no connect with the other workers in the industry. They don't connect with their social environment. This is again ensured by the capitalist setup to ensure that the workers do not feel any sense of ownership. They don't feel any sense of union, and they don't own the product, the process, or they don't have any sense of camaraderie with their fellow workers. This is a critique that Karl Marx developed of the capitalist model. See, we are not arguing that whatever Karl Marx said is right. We are just analyzing and discussing his theory of alienation. He said that in a capitalist setup, workers will be alienated. They will be alienated in 4 different ways. The worker will be alienated from the product, from the process, from humanity, and from other workers and from a social setting. So this was a critique by Karl Marx of the capitalist setup. Now, there are many other theories which have come up based on this. Thinkers like Kran and Lowe, they have built upon this theory and they have said that this alienation is more of a social, psychological alienation, where workers feel disconnected. They don't feel any sense of ownership. They feel meaningless, powerless in a capitalist setup where all the manners of production are controlled by the private enterprise. So this is a further interpretation of the theory of alienation that was developed by Karl Marx. According to other thinkers, political thinkers, the degree of alienation is also influenced by various factors. For example, the structure of bureaucracy, the organization structure, how the factory, the company is structured, the degree of ownership, the management skills of the management, the technology being employed. All these factors will determine the extent to which the labor class will be alienated from the product and the process and the humanity sense. Is that clear? So different theories have come up over the years based on the theory of alienation. Different interpretations have been brought out. Some theorists argue that this sense of alienation differs from working class to working class. According to certain thinkers, they observed that alienation is more amongst assembly line workers who work in factories, who carry out routine manual tasks, manual labor. Amongst them, there is a greater sense of alienation. Whereas you can't see the same degree of alienation amongst professionals, teachers, physicians, doctors, etc. So depending on the profession, the skills that are required, the degree of alienation differs according to some thinkers. And finally, this alienation, this social and economic alienation, can result in political alienation as well, where the working class is alienated as an electorate. They are no longer treated as legitimate voters in a society. They are alienated as a voting class and they don't connect with the political parties and the political class present. These are different interpretations of theory of alienation of Karl Marx. There is a lot of criticism against this theory as well. Many thinkers have brought out the critical points against this theory. For example, they say that Karl Marx, he did identify the theory of alienation, which did happen in factory line work, especially in a capitalist setup. But he did not evaluate the implications in detail and did not provide solutions as to how this could be eliminated. The exact consequences of alienation was not explained by Karl Marx, according to the critics. He didn't provide a solution as to how this problem could be tackled and how it could be eliminated from the industry. Others have argued that today labor markets have evolved. This theory of alienation is outdated, according to certain thinkers. They say that this theory of Karl Marx has no place in the industry today because there are labor laws present to protect the labor class or the working class. Their living and working conditions have improved. It's not as if the owners and the factory owners are dominating over the working class. They get their own rights. They have their own share in the profits that are made by the company. There are labor laws protecting their rights. So according to certain thinkers, labor markets have evolved, living working conditions have improved. So theory of alienation is outdated according to them. They also say that Marxism solely focused on the class divide, the divide between the proletariat and the working class, the divide between the oligarchy and the working class, basically the divide between the rich and the poor. So Karl Marx was solely focused on this class divide, and he ignores other forms of segregation arising out of racial bias or gender bias, right? Segregation arising out of caste-based divide in a society. These other forms of segregation are not focused upon by Karl Marx. He solely focuses on the class-based segregation. This is another criticism of the theory of alienation. And finally, the theory of alienation became so popular at one point, it gave rise to many subjective interpretations. Many thinkers came up with their own subjective interpretations, and hence, according to Ricord, a popular thinker in 1960s, the theory of alienation has lost its scientific value. It has lost its analytical potential because there are so many different interpretations, you can't really apply this theory to bring out any scientific assessment. To carry out any analytical assessment, it's not possible through this theory because multiple theories have come up based on the theory of alienation. So these are some criticisms of Karl Marx's theory of alienation. Now this theory is still applied by many thinkers with regard to the divide in the industry, the divide between the owners and the capitalist class and the labor class. Whenever labor issues come up, many thinkers, many writers, they talk about the theory of alienation. Some of them dismiss this altogether. They say it's an outdated theory which has no place in a modern economy, right? But either ways, as an aspirant, you should be familiar with the theory of alienation of Karl Marx. You should know the basics. The four types of alienation, the different interpretations which have come up, and the criticism against it. This concept can be very important for your optional papers and also for your general studies. Now coming to the last two articles, very small topics. We have an article on page 12 related to India-US relations. This article refers to a meeting between top officials of both the governments. India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, has met with his American counterpart, Jake Sullivan, who is the National Security Advisor of the Biden administration. The two top officials who head the respective national security councils have met, and they have not only discussed key security foreign policy issues, they've also held the first initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies Dialogue, or ICET dialogue. This dialogue was established last year between India and US during the quadrilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden. Both India-US agreed at last year's Quad meeting to collaborate in the field of critical emerging technologies. These technologies are driving the fourth stage of the Industrial Revolution. Technologies such as artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, 5G networks, big data, robotics, machine learning, these are classified as critical emerging technologies. So to promote collaboration in these technologies, to promote transfer of technology, and to provide for co-production, joint development of these technologies, India-US created a platform called ICET, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. The first dialogue has been held between the two national security advisors because this initiative is led by the national security councils of both the countries. So this meeting has taken place yesterday where India and US have exchanged their views about how they can collaborate in the field of critical emerging technologies. This initiative is led by the national security councils of both India and US. Parallelly, Mr. has met with his American counterparts from the US State Department because India-US are heading towards some important negotiations in the coming. India-US will be collaborating at the Quad and the G7 as well, right? So there are very big high-level engagements coming up. So India, US have taken stock of their relationship. They have reviewed their engagement at platforms like I2U2, which was created last year. It's an important grouping formed in West Asia that has brought India closer with Israel, UAE and USA. These four like-minded countries have formed a economic diplomatic alliance called I2U2, focused on West Asian geopolitics and geoeconomics. They have also taken part in Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was proposed by the US following the quadrilateral meeting. The US is championing a new economic framework for the Indo-Pacific region to counter China's RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a free trade agreement led by China in the Indo-Pacific. So US has proposed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Many countries have joined this initiative, including India. So both sides have taken stock of these developments and they've also reviewed their arrangement under the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative. This was also launched last year during last year's Quad Summit. India, US, Australia and Japan have agreed to take part in the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, which focuses on maritime surveillance in the Indo-Pacific. Maritime surveillance has become a priority for these countries as China becomes increasingly aggressive in the Indo-Pacific. So India, US have taken stock of all these initiatives that they are working together on. And along with that, the NSAs have held a discussion on the initiative on critical and emerging technologies. So these initiatives are something you should be familiar with as far as India-US relations are concerned. Now coming to the last article from page number 1, Andhra Pradesh has announced that Vizag shall be the new capital of the state in few months. This takes us back to the bifurcation of Telangana from Andhra Pradesh. A few years back, around 2009-2010, Telangana was bifurcated from Andhra Pradesh as per the provisions of Article 3 under the Indian Constitution. Right? There were massive protests in Telangana region calling for a separate state for Telangana, which pushed the union government to introduce an amendment. And under Article 3, the government provided for the bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. For the time being, Hyderabad had been made the joint capital until Andhra Pradesh could find a future capital for itself, as Hyderabad would become the capital of Telangana, the permanent capital of Telangana. So the then Chandrababu Naidu government had proposed a new capital at Amravati. A brand new city was supposed to come up at Amravati, which would become the future capital for Andhra Pradesh. But this proposal was quashed and it was changed by the Jagan Mohan Reddy government. When YS Jagan Mohan Reddy became the chief minister, his party proposed a new idea. They even brought out a law declaring that Andhra Pradesh will have 3 capitals. There would be one judicial capital at Kurnool. Amravati would become just the legislative capital for the state legislature, and Visakhapatnam or Vizag would become the executive capital from where the government would function. So 3 capital model was proposed by the Jagan Mohan Reddy government. This proposal invited a lot of backlash. A lot of petitions were filed at the High Court and Supreme Court, and the High Court has issued a stay against the creation of 3 capitals. It has ordered the state government to go back to the previous commitment of having just one capital, which is Amravati. So there are some petitions pending at the Supreme Court with regard to this. The Andhra Pradesh government has challenged the rulings of the High Court, the Andhra Pradesh High Court, and it has tried to push for the 3 capitals for Andhra Pradesh. So even while these petitions are still pending, even while the legal status is still not known, Jagan Mohan Reddy has made a very big announcement yesterday, and he has said that Andhra Pradesh will have a new capital in few months, which would be Vizag or Visakhapatnam. He has said the government administration, including his own office, the Chief Minister's office, will relocate to Visakhapatnam and ensure that Visakhapatnam becomes the new capital of Andhra Pradesh. This is still a developing story, so we need to wait and watch as to how developments will come up, and we need to wait for some concrete developments to happen. Because as of now, this is just a verbal statement from the Chief Minister, right? There will be some legal changes which are required, which will happen in the coming days. and also the status of the ongoing cases of the Supreme Court is also of concern. So we will have a more elaborate discussion on this in the coming days, but this is a development I want you to be aware of. All right. So this brings my discussion to an end, and please take these 2 questions for your answer writing practice. Please take up both the questions seriously, write your answers, post it in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been given in the description box below. So on this note, I bring my discussion to an end. I hope it was a fruitful discussion. Do let me know how it went by pressing the like button, share your comments below, and subscribe to our channel. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a quiz as soon as the session ends on our Telegram channel. So subscribe to our Telegram channel and take the quiz so you can prepare comprehensively for the upcoming prelims. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.